He didn't come for the coffee. He didn't come for the food. He came for one thing, and one thing only, the truth. At 79 years old, Richard Halbrook had spent a lifetime building something that outlived competitors, recessions, and even the people who once stood beside him. Steel plants, logistics networks, private investments that quietly shaped entire cities. His name carried weight in rooms he no longer bothered to enter. But on that morning, sitting alone in a modest diner off a rain-washed highway, none of that mattered. Because for the first time in decades, Richard wasn't trying to grow his empire. He was trying to understand it. He had seen numbers rise and fall, partnerships form and collapse, but what unsettled him now wasn't business. It was something closer, something quieter, something that had followed him home and settled at his table long before he arrived here. And it began with a single conversation he was never meant to hear. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 weeks earlier, in a house that overlooked the Hudson, Richard had woken earlier than usual. Age had a way of interrupting sleep, and on that morning it guided him towards something he could not ignore. As he made his way down the hallway, he heard voices coming from the study. His children. Their tones were calm, measured, almost professional. There was no grief in their voices, no hesitation, no sign of the man they were speaking about being just a few steps away. They spoke in percentages, in timelines, in strategies that assumed an ending had already been scheduled. One of them laughed softly at the idea of prolonging certain decisions. Another mentioned restructuring assets before it became complicated. Richard stood there longer than he would ever admit, listening not as a father but as a stranger hearing his own life reduced to paperwork. In that moment something shifted. Not anger, not even disappointment, just clarity. And once clarity settles in, it doesn't leave. That was the morning Richard Halbrook began to disappear. Not in a way anyone would notice immediately, but in small, deliberate steps. Meetings were canceled, calls went unanswered. His driver was given the week off. Even his closest advisors were told he needed rest, but Richard wasn't resting. He was observing. For decades, he had trusted instincts that made him one of the most respected figures in his industry. He could read hesitation in a handshake, doubt in a pause, greed in the way someone held eye contact just a second too long. Yet somehow he had missed what mattered most. Or perhaps he hadn't missed it. Perhaps he had simply chosen not to look too closely. That's what troubled him. Because if he had been wrong about the people closest to him, then what else had he misunderstood? And more importantly, who, if anyone, had been genuine all along? That question didn't lead him to boardrooms or offices. It led him somewhere far less impressive, a diner that had been standing longer than some of his companies. The kind of place where the floors creaked slightly under pressure, where the menu hadn't changed in years, and where no one cared who you were as long as you paid your bill. It was the perfect place to be invisible. And invisibility was exactly what Richard needed. He arrived without announcement, dressed in a coat he had bought from a second-hand store 2 towns over, the fabric slightly worn at the cuffs, the color faded just enough to avoid attention. His shoes, once polished to a mirror shine, now carried a dull finish that blended into the floor beneath him. To anyone watching, he was just another elderly man passing through, someone with time to spare and nowhere important to be. And that was the point. Because for the first time in his life, Richard wasn't interested in being recognized. He was interested in seeing how people behaved when there was nothing to gain, when status disappeared, when influence held no weight, when the only thing left was character. He chose a table near the window, where the rain traced slow patterns against the glass, and sat down without removing his coat. It wasn't long before she approached. Her name, as he would later learn, was Sarah Mitchell. Mid-40s, composed but visibly tired in the way people become when life demands consistency without offering much in return. She greeted him with a politeness that wasn't forced, took his order without rushing him, and moved on without lingering. There was nothing remarkable about the exchange. And yet Richard noticed everything. The way she balanced efficiency with patience, the way she acknowledged each customer without overplaying friendliness, the way she carried herself as if every interaction mattered even when no one was watching closely. It was subtle, but it was there. And subtle things had always been where truth lived. He ordered coffee, nothing more. He let time pass, watched the room, watched her. Watched how she responded to complaints, to indifference, to the quiet pressure of a long shift. Then, when the moment felt right, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it carefully on the table. Not hidden, not emphasized, just there. A simple gesture, but not a random one, because what happened next would tell him everything he needed to know. But here's what no one knew, and what no one in that quiet diner could have guessed as the rain pressed softly against the windows and the world outside moved on without noticing him. This was never about generosity. Richard Halbrook had given away more money in a single year than most people would see in a lifetime, and none of it had ever required a second thought. This was different. This was deliberate. This was personal. Because long before that $100 bill touched the table, long before Sarah Mitchell ever stepped into his line of sight, a decision had already begun forming in Richard's mind, shaped not by business, but by something far more unsettling. Betrayal has a way of arriving quietly. It doesn't announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It settles into conversations that sound ordinary at first, until you listen closely enough to understand what's really being said. And Richard had listened. He had heard the careful language his children used when they thought he was no longer part of the room. He had heard the assumptions, the quiet confidence that everything he had built was already theirs, just waiting for time to catch up. There was no urgency in their voices, no hesitation, only the calm certainty of people who believed the outcome was guaranteed. And in that certainty, Richard found something he could not ignore. Not anger, not disappointment, something colder. Something final. Because for the first time, he realized that the legacy he had spent his life protecting might not survive the people he had trusted to carry it forward. And that realization changed everything. It changed how he saw his own family. It changed how he measured loyalty. And it led him to a question he could not answer from inside the walls of his own home. If the people closest to him could speak about his life as if it were already over, then what did loyalty actually look like? Not in words, not in promises, but in action. And if loyalty could not be found among those who stood to inherit everything, then where could it be found? That was the question that followed him into that diner. That was the reason he sat quietly, watching, waiting, measuring something that could not be written into contracts or negotiated across boardroom tables. Because somewhere between the silence of that morning in his hallway and the sound of rain tapping against the glass beside him, Richard Halbrook had made a decision that would alter the course of everything he had built. And that decision rested on a moment so small, most people would never notice it. A waitress, a tip, a choice. The questions are simple, but the answers are not. Why would a man who controlled billions reduce everything to a single interaction with someone who had nothing to gain from him? What could Sarah Mitchell possibly do in that brief moment that would carry enough weight to challenge years of trust, years of expectation, years of carefully planned inheritance? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what happened after that moment, after that decision was made in silence, that left his own family standing on the outside of a life they believed was already theirs? Because by the time anyone realized what Richard Halbrook had done, it was already too late to change it. Richard Halbrook had not been born into comfort, and that fact shaped everything about the man he became. Long before the tailored suits, before the boardrooms and private flights, there was a version of him that most people would never recognize. A young man working double shifts, saving every dollar, learning quickly that stability was something you built, not something you inherited. He came from a time where a handshake meant something, where showing up early and leaving late was not ambition but expectation. There were no shortcuts in his world, no safety nets waiting beneath him if things went wrong. And things did go wrong, more than once. Early ventures failed, partnerships dissolved, opportunities slipped through his hands just when they seemed certain. But Richard had something that couldn't be taught, a refusal to stay down when circumstances pushed him there. He adjusted, recalculated, and kept moving forward. That persistence, steady and unrelenting, became the foundation of everything that followed. Over decades, he built an empire piece by piece, not through sudden luck, but through consistent decisions made under pressure. He understood risk, but he respected discipline more. He trusted data, but he trusted instinct even more. And eventually, the world began to recognize what he had created. His companies expanded, his influence grew, and his name carried weight in industries that once overlooked him entirely. But for all the success that surrounded him, there was one part of his life that remained untouched by business strategy: his family. That was where he believed the real value of his life would be measured. That was where he expected his legacy to mean something beyond numbers. For years, that belief held steady. His children grew up with opportunities he never had, educated in the best schools, exposed to environments that prepared them to step into the world with confidence. They were intelligent, capable, and outwardly successful in their own ways. From the outside, it looked like everything had worked exactly as it should. But success, Richard would later realize, does not always translate into understanding. Somewhere along the way, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately raise concern, but slowly, quietly, over time. Conversations became more transactional. Time spent together felt more like obligation than connection. There was a distance that couldn't be measured, but it was there, present in the pauses, in the way decisions were discussed around him instead of with him. And then there were moments, small at first, easy to dismiss, comments that carried an edge of assumption. "Dad's not thinking clearly anymore." It was said lightly, almost casually, but the meaning behind it lingered. Another voice, calm and practical, followed. "We need to secure what's ours before things get complicated." There was no hostility in their tone, no anger, no open disrespect. That was what made it more unsettling. It wasn't cruelty. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when people believe something already belongs to them, even if it hasn't been given. They weren't villains in their own minds. They were simply preparing, organizing, planning ahead. But in doing so, they revealed something Richard could not ignore. They saw his life as a transition, not a presence. And once that understanding settled in, it changed how he saw everything. It would be easy to paint them as ungrateful, to reduce their actions to something simple, but reality is rarely that clear. They had grown up in a world shaped by abundance, where comfort was expected, where access replaced effort, where the consequences of failure were softened by resources always within reach. They didn't build what Richard built, and because of that, they didn't carry the same relationship with it. To them, the empire was a structure already standing, not something fragile that required constant attention to maintain. That difference, subtle but significant, created a gap that could not be bridged by money alone. And Richard, for all his experience, had not fully accounted for it. He had provided everything except the one thing that cannot be transferred: perspective. That realization did not come all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, in conversations overheard, in expressions that lingered a second too long, in decisions made without consultation. And eventually, those fragments formed a picture he could no longer deny. The people he had trusted to carry forward his life's work did not see it the way he did. They saw it as theirs already. And that belief, quiet as it was, carried consequences. At the same time, in a part of the city far removed from private estates and financial meetings, Sarah Mitchell moved through her own routine, one shaped not by abundance, but by necessity. Her days were structured around responsibilities that didn't allow for much flexibility. She had been divorced for several years, a chapter of her life that ended without resolution, but left behind lessons she didn't talk about often. There was no bitterness in the way she carried herself, but there was caution, a quiet awareness of how quickly stability can shift. She worked long hours, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to. Her mother's health had been declining steadily, and the cost of care added a constant pressure that never fully disappeared. Every shift mattered. Every dollar had a purpose. But what stood out about Sarah wasn't struggle. It was how she handled it. There was a steadiness in her approach, a consistency that didn't change based on who she was serving or how her day was going. She treated people with the same level of attention, whether they noticed her or not. not out of obligation but out of habit. And habits, over time, reveal character more clearly than intentions ever could. She was not extraordinary in the way stories often present people. She didn't command attention when she entered a room, didn't carry herself with the confidence of someone expecting recognition. If anything, she blended into her environment, part of the rhythm of a place that depended on reliability more than personality. But there was something else there, something that wasn't immediately visible but became clear the longer you observed. She paid attention. Not just to orders or tasks, but to people. The way someone hesitated before speaking, the way a tone shifted when a conversation changed direction, the way silence could say more than words. These were things she noticed without making it obvious. And in a world where most interactions are rushed, where people move past each other without truly seeing one another, that kind of awareness is rare. It doesn't draw attention, but it leaves an impression. On the surface, there was no reason for Richard Halbrook and Sarah Mitchell to ever cross paths. Their lives existed on entirely different levels, separated by circumstances that rarely intersect. One operated in a world defined by influence and scale, the other in a space defined by routine and immediate responsibility. But what connected them was not their situation. It was something less visible, something that couldn't be measured in financial terms. A question. One that Richard had spent a lifetime answering in business. The question followed Richard Halbrook into that diner, settling into the quiet space around him as naturally as the sound of rain against the windows. By the time he stepped inside, he had already decided that whatever answer he found would not come from people who knew his name. It would come from someone who had no reason to treat him any differently than anyone else. That was the only way to remove influence from the equation, to see behavior without expectation, to understand how people respond when there is nothing to gain. He moved carefully, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention. The coat he wore hung slightly loose at the shoulders, its fabric worn enough to suggest years of use. It was the kind of detail most people would overlook, but Richard had chosen it deliberately. Every element of his appearance had been adjusted, not to disguise who he was entirely, but to remove the signals that would normally define him. There were no polished shoes catching the light, no watch worth more than the average person's yearly salary, no subtle indicators of wealth that might influence how he was perceived. He had stripped himself down to something simple, something unremarkable. And as he stepped fully into the diner, it worked exactly as he intended. No one looked twice. No one paused. No one recognized him. For a man who had spent decades being acknowledged the moment he entered a room, the absence of attention was noticeable, but it was also necessary. He chose a seat near the window, the kind of place where he could observe without being observed too closely. The menu sat in front of him, slightly worn at the edges, its contents familiar in a way that suggested consistency rather than variety. When Sarah Mitchell approached, there was no hesitation in her tone, no shift in her posture, no indication that she saw anything unusual about him. She greeted him the same way she had greeted every other customer that morning, with a balance of politeness and efficiency that came from repetition rather than performance. Richard placed a simple order, something that required little attention, and she acknowledged it with a brief nod before moving on. It was a normal interaction, the kind that happens thousands of times a day without leaving any impression. But for Richard, this was where the test began. Not in the money, not in the gesture, but in the environment he had created. Because before you can understand how someone responds to a moment, you have to understand how they behave without one. He watched as Sarah moved through the diner, carrying plates, refilling cups, responding to requests that ranged from routine to impatient. There were no dramatic moments, no obvious signs of strain, just a steady rhythm of work that required attention without recognition. And in that rhythm, Richard saw something he hadn't expected. Not perfection, not anything extraordinary, just consistency. The kind that doesn't depend on who is watching. When she returned with his order, he shifted the tone slightly. Not enough to draw attention, not enough to create conflict, but enough to introduce friction. His words were brief, his tone less warm than before, his responses measured in a way that suggested mild dissatisfaction without stating it directly. It was controlled, intentional, a subtle provocation designed to see if her demeanor would change. Many people adjust their behavior based on how they are treated, matching tone with tone, reflecting irritation with distance. But Sarah did not. There was no visible reaction, no shift in her approach. She acknowledged his comments without engaging them emotionally, responded with the same level of professionalism, and continued her work without hesitation. It was a small detail, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Richard was. Because in his experience, character is often revealed not in how people behave when things are easy, but in how they respond when they are slightly challenged. And Sarah's response, or rather her lack of reaction, was noted. Time passed slowly, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because Richard allowed it to. He finished his meal without rushing, maintaining the same measured presence he had established from the moment he walked in. And then, without drawing attention, he reached into his coat and removed the $100 bill. It was crisp, untouched, a stark contrast to the worn environment around it. He placed it on the table carefully, not as a gesture meant to be seen immediately, but as something that would reveal itself naturally. There was no note, no explanation, no indication that it was anything other than a tip. And then he waited, not in anticipation but in observation, because the moment itself was not the action of leaving the money. It was what came after. When Sarah returned, her movements were the same as before, efficient, focused, unaware of what she was about to notice. She reached for the check, her attention briefly on the table, and then it happened. Her hand paused, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from across the room, but just enough to indicate that something was different. Her eyes shifted from the check to the bill, taking in the amount, registering it in a way that required a second look. She didn't react immediately. There was no quick decision, no automatic acceptance. Instead, she stood there for a moment, the kind of pause that suggests thought rather than surprise. Richard watched closely, not just at what she would do, but how she would do it. Her expression didn't change in any obvious way, but there was a subtle shift in her focus, a quiet evaluation of the situation in front of her. She glanced toward him briefly, then back at the money, as if confirming what she was seeing. Most people in that moment would have made a quick decision. They would have taken the tip, perhaps with a sense of satisfaction, perhaps with a passing thought about the generosity of a stranger, and moved on. The moment would end there, absorbed into the routine of the day, forgotten as quickly as it occurred. That is what Richard had seen before. That is what he expected to see again. Because in most cases, people do not question unexpected gain. They accept it. They justify it. They move forward without looking back. And for a brief second, it seemed like this moment might follow the same pattern. But it didn't. Sarah did not reach for the money immediately. She didn't slide it into her apron or treat it as something already decided. Instead, she looked at Richard again, this time with intention, as if the answer she needed was not in the amount, but in the person who had left it. There was no suspicion in her expression, no assumption of error, just a quiet consideration that held her in place longer than expected. And in that pause, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the environment, but in the direction of the moment itself. Because what happens next in situations like this is usually predictable. But this time it was. Most people would have taken it and said nothing. But Sarah Mitchell didn't. What happened next did not unfold quickly, and that was precisely what made it matter. Sarah Mitchell did not treat the moment as an opportunity. She treated it as a question that needed an answer. With the same steady pace she had carried throughout her shift, she picked up the check, left the bill exactly where it was, and walked back toward Richard Halbrook. There was no hesitation in her steps, but there was intention. When she reached his table, her voice remained calm, her tone respectful, but there was a quiet firmness behind it that suggested she had already made a decision before speaking. She placed the check gently in front of him and gestured slightly toward the money still resting on the table. She didn't accuse, didn't assume, didn't dramatize the situation. Instead, she approached it the way someone does when they believe clarity is more important than convenience. She told him in simple terms that the amount seemed too high, that it might have been left by mistake, and that she wanted to make sure he intended to leave it. It was not a refusal, not yet. It was something more measured, an invitation for him to confirm what he had done or correct it if he hadn't meant to. For a brief moment, Richard said nothing. He looked at her the way he had looked at countless people across decades of negotiations, observing not just her words, but the way she delivered them. There was no trace of expectation in her voice, no subtle attempt to secure the money while appearing cautious. She wasn't trying to influence the outcome. She was trying to understand it, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. Around them, the diner continued as it always did, orders being called, plates moving between tables, conversations rising and falling without interruption. But at that table, the pace had shifted. What had started as a quiet test was now something more deliberate, something that required a response. Before Richard could speak, a voice from a nearby table cut into the moment. Another customer, watching the exchange with mild curiosity, leaned back in his chair and offered an opinion that reflected what most people were likely thinking. "Just take it," he said, his tone casual, almost dismissive. "People like him won't even notice." It wasn't meant to be confrontational. It was practical, the kind of advice given without much thought, rooted in a belief that opportunity should not be questioned when it appears. Sarah acknowledged the comment with a brief glance, but she didn't accept it. She didn't argue, didn't challenge the logic behind it, but she also didn't adjust her position. Her attention returned to Richard, waiting for his answer, holding the moment in place rather than letting it move forward on assumption. And in that choice, something became clear. This was no longer about the money. It was about how she defined responsibility in a situation where most people would choose convenience. Richard remained silent, but internally he was measuring everything. Not just her words, but the timing, the consistency, the way her actions aligned with her earlier behavior. Because this was not the first time he had placed someone in this position. This was not the first time he had removed the signals of status and introduced a moment that required a decision without guidance. Over the past weeks, he had repeated variations of this test in different places, with different people, each time searching for the same thing. And each time, the outcome had followed a pattern he had come to expect. There were those who noticed the money and took it immediately, their actions quick, their reasoning unspoken but clear. There were those who hesitated briefly, looked around as if confirming no one was watching, and then accepted it with a quiet sense of justification. There were even those who ignored him entirely, treating him as invisible until the transaction was complete, their attention reserved only for what they could gain. And then there were moments that revealed something more concerning. A server who became overly attentive once the tip was noticed, shifting her behavior in a way that felt calculated rather than genuine. A man who had spoken to him with impatience, only to return moments later with exaggerated politeness after realizing there might be something to gain. These were not extreme actions, not enough to stand out in isolation, but when viewed together, they formed a pattern Richard had spent his entire career learning to recognize. Behavior changes when incentives are introduced. Character reveals itself when those incentives are removed. And so far, every version of this test had confirmed the same conclusion. Until now. Because Sarah Mitchell had not followed the pattern, she had not taken the money, she had not ignored the situation, she had not adjusted her behavior based on what she stood to gain. Instead, she had paused, considered, and returned to the source of the action to ensure it was intentional. It was a small difference, almost insignificant when viewed on its own. But for Richard, it carried weight, because it suggested something he had not seen in the others: consistency without condition. And yet the moment was not over, not completely, because what she did next would determine whether that consistency held under pressure. The other customer's comment lingered in the air, a reminder of the easier path, the one most people would take without hesitation. And for a brief second it seemed possible that Sarah might reconsider, that she might accept the explanation offered and move on. But she didn't. Her posture remained unchanged, her attention fixed, her decision intact. She refused, not with defiance, not with resistance, but with quiet certainty. She explained again calmly that she could not accept the amount without knowing it was meant to be given. There was no performance in her words, no attempt to appear virtuous. It was simply the standard she had set for herself, applied without adjustment. Richard watched all of it without interruption, without revealing anything in his expression. To anyone observing from a distance, it would have looked like a simple exchange between a customer and a waitress, a minor misunderstanding about a tip. But beneath that surface, something far more significant was taking place. A decision was forming, shaped not by a single action, but by a series of consistent choices made without awareness of their consequence. And as the moment stretched just a little longer than expected, as the silence between them held steady, one thing became increasingly clear. Sarah Mitchell had done something he had not seen before. The moment did not break with noise or sudden movement. It settled, quietly, into something heavier than either of them had anticipated. Sarah Mitchell stood there for a second longer than necessary, as if weighing not the money, but the situation itself, and then she spoke in a way that carried no accusation, no judgment, only a clarity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the moment they were in. She told him gently that she didn't know what he was going through, that she couldn't pretend to understand why someone would leave that amount without explanation, but that money, no matter how much of it there was, shouldn't feel like a test. The words were simple, but they landed with a precision Richard Halbrook had not expected. Because for the first time since he began this quiet experiment, someone had seen past the action itself and questioned the intention behind it. She wasn't responding to the amount. She was responding to what it represented, and in doing so, she revealed something Richard had spent weeks trying to find. Not just honesty, not just restraint, but awareness. The ability to recognize when something carries weight beyond its surface. For a brief moment, Richard considered responding, considered stepping out of the role he had constructed and explaining what this really was, why he was there, what he had been searching for. But he didn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because the moment had already given him what he needed. Anything he added now would change it, reshape it into something influenced by explanation rather than instinct. And instinct was the only thing that mattered here. So instead, he gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in acknowledgement of her words, but in quiet acceptance of what had just taken place. He reached for the check, adjusted the bill slightly on the table, and without offering further clarification, stood up. There was no dramatic exit, no lingering glance, no attempt to leave an impression. He walked toward the door the same way he had entered, unnoticed by most, unremarkable in appearance, carrying with him a decision that had not yet been spoken but had already been made. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like the end of a minor interaction, something that would fade from memory as quickly as it occurred. And for a moment, it felt that way. The door closed behind him, the rain continued its steady rhythm, and the diner returned to its usual pace, absorbing the moment without recognizing its significance. Sarah stood there briefly after he left, looking at the table, at the money still resting where it had been placed, at the space he had occupied just moments before. There was no sense of triumph in her expression, no indication that she believed she had done anything unusual. If anything, there was a quiet uncertainty, the kind that comes when a situation doesn't fully resolve in a way you expect. She picked up the bill carefully, not with urgency, but with the same measured attention she had shown throughout the interaction, and stepped away, carrying on with her shift as if nothing had changed. And from her perspective, nothing had. She had done what felt right, what aligned with her understanding of fairness, and moved forward. There was no reason for her to believe that the moment held any consequence beyond itself. That was what made it matter. Across the city, in a building where decisions were rarely made without layers of discussion and review, something began to shift. That evening, Richard Halbrook sat in an office he had occupied for years, a space defined by control, by certainty, by outcomes that could be measured and predicted. But this decision was different. It did not come from data, from projections, or from calculated risk. It came from something far less tangible, something he had spent his life trusting, but had rarely needed to rely on so completely. He reached for a file that had remained unchanged for longer than most of the people in his company had been employed. It contained plans, distributions, allocations carefully structured to ensure that everything he had built would be transferred in a way that made sense, that followed logic, that aligned with expectation. But as he looked at it now, it no longer reflected what he understood to be true. The next morning, his legal team was called in. There was no urgency in the request, no indication that anything significant was about to change, just a routine meeting placed on the calendar without explanation. When they arrived, they found him exactly as they expected, composed, precise, focused. But the conversation that followed was not routine. Richard spoke clearly, outlining adjustments that did not align with previous discussions, changes that required immediate attention, revisions that would alter the structure of everything they had prepared. There were questions, of course, careful ones, framed in a way that respected his authority while seeking clarity. But Richard did not offer more than what was necessary. He did not explain the diner, the moment, the conversation that had led him here. He did not mention Sarah Mitchell. Because what mattered was not the story, it was the decision, and the decision had already been made. That night, as documents were reviewed, rewritten, and prepared for execution, something quietly shifted in the foundation of an empire that had stood unchanged for decades. The structure remained, the assets remained, the value remained. But the direction, the intention behind it, had been altered in a way no one outside that room could yet understand. And when it was done, when the final version was placed in front of him, Richard Halbrook took a moment before signing, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Because in all his years of making decisions that affected thousands of people, this one stood apart. Not because of its scale, but because of its origin. It had not come from strategy. It had come from a single moment, a single interaction, a single sentence that had reframed everything he thought he understood. And as his signature settled onto the page, formalizing a change that would soon ripple outward in ways no one could predict, one thing became certain. That night, Richard Halbrook made a decision that would shock everyone. The day the will was read did not arrive with warning, but it carried a weight that everyone in the room could feel the moment they stepped inside. Richard Halbrook's children gathered with a quiet confidence that had been building for years, shaped by assumptions that had never been challenged. They were composed, prepared, already thinking ahead to what came next, how responsibilities would be divided, how the empire would transition into their hands. The atmosphere was controlled, almost routine, as if this was simply the final step in a process that had already been decided long before that day. There was no tension in their posture, no uncertainty in their expressions. To them, this was not a question of outcome. It was a confirmation. The legal team sat across from them, documents arranged with precision, every detail accounted for, every instruction ready to be delivered exactly as written. And then it began. The language was formal, structured, the kind of wording that carries authority without emotion. But as the details unfolded, something in the room began to shift. It was subtle at first, a slight change in attention, a pause that lasted just a fraction longer than expected. And then it became clear. The structure they had assumed would remain intact had been altered. Not slightly, completely. The majority of Richard Halbrook's estate was no longer directed where they believed it would be. The assets, the control, the influence that came with everything he had built had been reassigned through a structure none of them had anticipated. A trust, a foundation, and at the center of it a name that meant nothing to them. Sarah Mitchell. For a moment the room held still, as if the words required time to settle before they could be understood. Then came the reactions, not all at once but in fragments. Confusion surfaced first, quiet and restrained, followed quickly by disbelief that sharpened the tone of every question that followed. They asked for clarification, for confirmation that what they had heard was accurate, that there had not been some misunderstanding in the reading. But there was no mistake. The documents were clear. The instructions had been deliberate. What Richard had built over a lifetime had not been handed down as expected. It had been redirected. And not to someone within their circle, not to a partner, not to an institution they recognized, but to a woman none of them had ever heard of. The shift from confusion to anger did not take long. It moved through the room in controlled expressions, in tightened voices, in the kind of restrained frustration that comes when something certain is suddenly removed without warning. They questioned the reasoning, the process, the validity of the decision itself. But the more they pressed, the more evident it became that there was nothing to challenge. Everything had been executed properly. Every requirement had been met. The decision was final. Outside of that room, far removed from the tension unfolding within it, Sarah Mitchell moved through her day without any awareness that her name had just altered the course of a legacy she had never been part of. She continued her routine, the same responsibilities, the same pace, the same quiet consistency that had defined her life long before Richard Halbrook ever walked into that diner. There had been no contact, no explanation, no indication that the moment they shared carried any significance beyond itself. And that was exactly how Richard had intended it, because what mattered to him was not how she would react to the outcome, but how she had acted when there was no outcome to consider. She had not known who he was. She had not adjusted her behavior based on possibility or reward. She had responded to the moment as it was presented without expectation, without calculation. And in doing so, she had answered a question Richard had spent weeks trying to resolve. Not about wealth, not about loyalty in the way it is often defined, but about responsibility. Who understands it? Who carries it without being asked? Who applies it consistently, even when no one is watching? As the reality of the decision settled in, both inside that room and beyond it, one thing became increasingly clear. Richard Halbrook had not simply redistributed his assets. He had redefined what they represented. The empire he built was never just about financial success. It was about control, about structure, about the ability to make decisions that shaped outcomes far beyond his immediate reach. And in the end, he chose to place that control in the hands of someone who had demonstrated in a moment that most would overlook that she understood the weight of a decision before knowing its reward. It was not a choice based on familiarity. It was not influenced by expectation. It was based on a single interaction that revealed something he could not find anywhere else. Consistency, integrity, awareness, the kind that does not shift when circumstances change. In the end, it wasn't about who needed the money. It was about who deserved the responsibility. And that distinction, simple as it may seem, carried more weight than anything Richard Halbrook could have written into a contract. Because money can be divided, power can be transferred, but responsibility, the kind that defines how those things are used, cannot be assigned without trust. And trust, once tested, reveals more than words ever could. So the question remains, not just about Sarah Mitchell, not just about Richard Halbrook, but about anyone placed in a moment where the outcome is uncertain and the choice is entirely their own. If you were in her position, would you have passed the test? Stories like this remind us that the moments that shape everything rarely arrive with warning, and they almost never look important when they first appear. When Richard Halbrook walked into that diner, no one saw a decision being made. They saw an older man ordering coffee, sitting quietly, leaving behind an amount of money that could easily be explained away as generosity or mistake. And when Sarah Mitchell paused, when she chose to question it instead of accept it, when she stood there and asked for clarity instead of convenience, no one around her understood that the weight of that choice would extend far beyond that table. Because character isn't proven when people are watching. It isn't measured in situations where expectations are clear and outcomes are known. It reveals itself in moments where there is no audience, no pressure to perform, no promise of reward. It shows up in the decisions we make when the easier path is right in front of us, when no one would question us for taking it, when the outcome feels small enough to ignore. That's where the real answer is found. Richard Halbrook spent a lifetime building something the world could see, but in the end, what mattered most to him was something far less visible. A single moment, a single decision, a single response that told him more about trust than years of familiarity ever could. So now the question shifts away from him, away from Sarah Mitchell, and turns toward you. Not as a story to observe, but as a situation to consider. What would you have done if you were standing in her place, if that moment unfolded in front of you without explanation, without context, without anyone there to guide your decision? Would you have taken the money and moved on, telling yourself it made no difference, that it was harmless, that no one would ever know? Or would you have paused, questioned it, stepped back from the convenience of the situation and chosen something that felt right, even if it meant giving something up? Let me know in the comments, because the answer says more than you might think. And if this story made you stop for a moment, if it made you reflect on how decisions are made when no one is watching, then there's another story waiting for you. One that explores a different moment, a different choice, but the same question at its core.